The Betrayal of Albion, Part 2, 1066 and all that. When I was researching the Norman conquest some 30 years ago, it was generally agreed in the books I read that the Normans were not from Normandy, but were an elite group of wealthy aristocrats from northern Europe. Now that has all changed. These days, they tell us that some huge great Viking called Rollo was invading northern France during the 9th and 10th centuries and settling his people in the area of Normandy, which they claim literally means land of the Northmen. Nor is north in French, but man is homme and only means man in English. Mand in French relates to good food as in gourmand. As for the land of Bit, who knows? The land occupied by this Scandinavian colony was officially and supposedly granted to Rollo by the Franks in 911. What a number. And then absorbed into the Frankish kingdom. Rollo became a duke, and the Vikings became French, and then one day a chap called William the Bastard as he was known at the time because he hadn't conquered anywhere yet, and his gang decided on a day trip across the English Channel for a bit of duty-free shopping in Hastings. They liked it so much they stayed. All of this in just 150 or so years. The first charter of William I in 1067 stated that the citizens, burgesses, in London are declared to be law-worthy as they were in the days of Edward the Confessor. Every child shall be his father's heir after his father's days. I will not suffer any person to do you wrong. However, the conch story states that after the Battle of Hastings in October 1066, he just had 4 months to fight his way to London, confront the city, and issue the charter as he was back home in France for a year from March 1067, sorting out a few problems. London never gets a mention in the narrative because rebellion in the north kept him very busy when he got back. In his absence, his half-brother and some other guy were in charge and apparently had been on a whirlwind tour of the country building castles all over the place inside a year. Castles were a Norman invention, of course. Furthermore, the usual Norman tactic when confronted with a walled city was to starve it out. Apart from just surrounding the place to prevent anything going in or coming out, war parties stripped the surrounding land of supplies to hinder any relief troops and to help guarantee that no assistance would be forthcoming. Personally, I doubt Bill just rolled over and let the Anglo-Saxon city of Londoners have their own little mini-kingdom inside his brand spanking new one. What sounds far more likely is that William brought his Jews with him and installed them in the city of London under a similar arrangement to the one we have seen in 1084 in Speyer, Germany, whereby Bishop Rudiger offered the Maine's Jewish refugees his personal protection, self-government, and even a strong wall around their area of settlement so that Christian commercial competitors in town would not be tempted to harm their new Jewish neighbors. The fire in Mainz may have been genuine or may not, may have been a rebellion by the people of Mainz against the privileged and protected Jews. No way of knowing. Whatever happened, the Bish wasn't concerned about the welfare of anyone other than the Jews, so it's fair to assume that they were the only ones affected by the fire in Mainz. The question is, though, what advantage was it that the Catholic Bishop Rudiger and all the other rulers who followed suit were getting from their Jews? Or were they partners in some way? This concept of monarchs and bishops referring to the Jews as ours is not one of ownership or slavery, but should be likened to other royal appointments such as counselors, advisors. The Jews identified themselves as his Jews because they were answerable only to the king, and he gave them his protection in return for their services. They saw themselves as partners of the king, but the king probably had quite a different idea. When William the Conqueror arrived in England in 1066, he encouraged Jewish merchants and artisans from northern France to move to England. The Jews came mostly from France, with some from Germany, Italy, and Spain, seeking prosperity and a haven from anti-Semitism. Serving as special representatives of the king, these Jews worked as moneylenders and coin dealers. Over the course of a generation, Jews established communities in London, York, Bristol, Canterbury, and other major cities. They generally lived in segregated areas by themselves. However, until 1177, only one Jewish cemetery was allowed to be established in London. The settlement of Jews in the city dates in all probability from the Roman period, the usual assumption. The first document, however, concerning the community contains an account in Hebrew of a terrible persecution which the Jews of Rouen and of other localities experienced at the beginning of the 11th century. In 1066, numerous Jews of Rouen emigrated to England, having been induced to settle there by William the Conqueror, who, while still in Normandy, had always protected them. His son, William Rufus, showed himself no less favorably inclined toward them. During the 12th century, a number of London Jews owned houses in the Jewish quarter of Rouen, while some Jews of Rouen had debtors in England. Rouen's Jews were, however, engaged in money lending to a lesser extent than the Jews of England. Richard I of England issued a charter by which many liberties are granted and confirmed to the Jews, 22nd March 1190. Richard, by the grace of God, King of England, Duke of Normandy, to his archbishops, bishops, greeting. I know that we have granted and, by the present charter, confirmed to Isaac son of Rabbi Joe and his sons and their men all their customs and liberties, just as the Lord King Henry, our father, granted and by his charter confirmed to the Jews of England and Normandy, namely, to reside in our land freely and honorably, and to hold all those things from us which the aforesaid Isaac and his sons held in the time of Henry the King, our father, in lands and fields and pledges and gifts and purchases, Ham, East Ham, London, which Henry our father gave them for their service, and Thurrock, Essex, which they said Isaac bought of the Count of Ferrars, and all the houses and messages and pledges which the said Isaac and his sons had in our land in the time of King Henry our father. And let the aforesaid Jews receive and buy at any time whatever is brought them, except things of the church and blood-stained garments. And we order that the Jews through all England and Normandy be free of all customs and of all tolls and moderation of wine, just like our own chattels, and we command and order you to ward and defend and protect them. And we forbid anyone against this charter about the aforesaid to put the said Jews into plea on our forfeit. It is obvious that the Jews of England and Normandy were one and the same entity and treated as such. During the Middle Ages, usury or lending money for interest was considered a sin by the Catholic Church. Therefore, Christians were forbidden to work as money lenders, and Jews were called to that occupation and were able to set high interest rates. They played a vital role in maintaining the British treasury, and for a time the Crown watched over the Jewish financiers and their property, though they also taxed them honestly. When successive kings wanted to go off fighting, usually against the French, they needed money, so would come to the city to get a loan, which of course he could never pay back. So instead he would offer various privileges, special powers, and so on. This carried on for centuries. As one of the four pillars of the ancient constitution, the city remains a partner to parliament, as well as the monarchy and the church, but not subordinate to it. Never was a more revealing mouthful spoken. Partners, not subordinate, but equal. This is what it's always been about, a partnership between the Catholic Church and the Jews, between monarchs and their Jews, between governments and the Jews. The Jews represented a cash cow for the king, as he could rob the Jews just as easily as they could rob the people. In that respect, they were the financial middleman between the king and his people. They were also highly skilled and well-connected international merchants with royal exemption from taxes and tolls. Traditionally, the Jewish community in the city was centered on the area known as Old Jewry. However, by 1232, in spite of the onerous taxation, a magnificent new synagogue appeared in what is now Threadneedle Street, up beside the Royal Exchange. The king, Henry III, confiscated it and handed it to the Brethren of St. Anthony. Here we have that word great. It will come up a lot. Wikipedia is not at all happy with this idea, as can be seen in this garbled entry, which also unwittingly provides the answer as to why it was confiscated. However, it is unlikely a synagogue had ever occupied a site in the parish of St. Bennet-Fink, as such Jewish places of worship were confined to the Jewry district of the city, some distance away to the east. It is possible, therefore, that either the brothers changed their quarters afterwards, or at one time the Jews had spread beyond the Jewry. Such an outlying synagogue may have been permitted by the 1252 decree of King Henry III, that there should be no synagogues except where they existed during the reign of his father, King John. Source, Wikipedia source, of course. The Great Eviction. King Edward I's expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 was the start of what Jewish historians call the Great Eviction, and there have that epithet again, the Great. There was a very delicate balance in the relationship between the people, the Jews, and the king. The people blamed the Jews for high rents, interest rates, and prices. The Jews blamed the king for overtaxation, and the king didn't trust that the Jews were playing fair with him. This was a recipe for disaster, and in Albion, that disaster culminated in the 1290 expulsion. It was only in the late 13th century that some Christian kings tightened their control over Jewish life in Europe. The King of England expelled his Jews, perhaps 2,000 people, in 1290, and the King of France expelled his, possibly 80,000, in 1306. There probably were as many French Jews forced into exile in 1306 as there were Iberian Jews expelled from Castile and Aragon in 1492. Please note the use of the term Haze Jews. The Middle Period. Jewish historians refer to the period between their Great Eviction from England and their resettlement as the Middle Period. The Domus Conversorum, established by Henry III in 1232, housed nearly 100 converts at the period of the expulsion, and never remained entirely empty in subsequent years. There was a constant, though slender, stream to London of poor foreign Jews who qualified for emoluments by the formal adoption of Christianity. In addition, a few isolated Jews visited London without being baptized. For example, the physicians Elias Sabbatai of Bologna, who came in 1410 with 10 followers to attend Henry IV, and Master Samson de Mirabeau, who attended the wife of Richard Whittington, mayor of London, in 1409. After the expulsions from Spain and Portugal, 1492, a few Marrano Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity, refugees, settled in London. At the close of the reign of Henry VIII, the crypto-Jewish community comprised some 37 householders, and religious services were held in the house of one Elvis Lopes, to whom newly arrived fugitives would come for assistance and advice. It was largely dispersed as a result of the Catholic reaction in the reign of Mary. Under Elizabeth, however, it again attained significant proportions. One of its leading members was Rodrigo Lopez, the Queen's physician. Toward the end of the century, the importance of the secret community diminished, and in 1609, the Portuguese merchants living in London who were suspected of Judaizing were again expelled. By Wikipedia, we know that Rodrigo Lopez served as physician-in-chief to Queen Elizabeth I of England from 1581 until his death by execution, having been found guilty of plotting to poison her. A Portuguese converso or new Christian of Jewish ancestry, he is the only royal doctor in English history to have been executed and may have inspired the character of Shylock in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, which was written within 4 years of his death. The Jesuit conspiracy. This was all occurring against a backdrop of religious schisms within Christianity in the British Isles. In fact, 1605 saw that what must be one of the earliest false flag events on record, namely the Gunpowder Plot. It was also known as the Jesuit conspiracy for very good reason, as they had been instrumental in inciting the patsies. Fear of the French sailing up the Thames and blowing up Parliament was very popular at the time, no doubt having been encouraged in the media, and so the scene was set. The barrels of gunpowder that were discovered under the House of Lords were all filled with dirt, according to eyewitnesses. The perpetrators all died horrible deaths at the hands of the executioner. Well, all except the Jesuit Father John Gerard, who, judging by his miraculous escape from the Tower of London in 1597, was an ancestor of Spider-Man. Legislation against Catholics intensified, as might be expected, and the divide and rule stepped up a notch. The effigy of Guy Fawkes, Patsy numero uno, has been burned on bonfires across Britain annually on the 5th November since the 19th century, although it may not be all that it seems, as we shall see later. It may be noted that the most stalwart of those few Jews who penetrated into England in the Middle Period, the mining engineer Joachim Gonzi, who was expelled for his outspoken religious views, and the Jacob Barnett, who fled from Oxford rather than submit to baptism, both happened to be Ashkenazim. There is indeed evidence that they constituted a recognizable group, Ashkenazim, at a comparatively early date. The late Lucian Wolff used to speak of a contemporary account of the arrival in London in 1648 or 1649 of a whole shipload of Polish Jewish refugees from the recent massacres at the hands of the Cossacks. In 1632, the Marrano community of Rouen, Normandy, was temporarily broken up. some fugitives, the most important being Antonio Fernandez Carvajal, the Great Jew, found a home in London. Other Marano settlers went directly from Spain and Portugal. Thus, when Manasseh ben Israel went to England in 1655, there was already established a secret community numbering several families. Manasseh ben Israel arrived in November 1655. His arrival was extremely significant, as we shall see. During his absence from the Netherlands, the Amsterdam rabbis excommunicated his student Baruch Spinoza. Both of these characters weren't a threat to themselves, really. Meanwhile, back in the city, the vacuum left by the Jewish moneylenders, traders, and merchants obviously didn't last long. It was during this middle period that the Hanseatic League appeared and were allowed to trade in the city. They occupied a large premises right on the river Thames known as the Steelyard. Accounts of their doings are confused, to say the least, but it seems they were resented and persecuted in the city. Crypto Jews were also present and believed to have carried on their business using Christian front men.